Eric was a 45-year-old divorcee who had long given up on love. A successful architect with salt-and-pepper hair and a quiet demeanor, he had grown accustomed to his peaceful, predictable life. That changed the day he met Zoe. She was 24, energetic, magnetic, and worked as a hostess at the upscale bar Eric's firm had just redesigned. The first time she greeted him, her eyes lit up. "Hey you," she said, drawing out the words with a playful smirk, as if they shared a secret. It wasn't the usual polite hospitality. It was something else, warmer, more intimate. Eric brushed it off at first. She was young, after all, and probably just being friendly. But every time he came in, Zoe greeted him with the same spark in her eyes, that same sing-song voice, and a lingering glance. Eventually, she started joining him for drinks after her shift. Their conversations ran deep, from art to travel to the disappointments of modern love. Despite the age difference, they fell into a whirlwind romance. Zoe made Eric feel alive again, and he gave her the stability and attentiveness she claimed she'd never had. He introduced her to fine dining, weekend getaways, and his quiet world of classical music and red wine. She brought chaos and color into his life. It was intoxicating. But something was off. Zoe's phone was always face down. She flinched whenever he reached for it, even just to move it aside. Late-night texts made her excuse herself from bed, saying it was work, though she had quit the bar months ago. And then there were the absences. She'd disappear for hours, sometimes overnight, offering vague explanations about needing space to think. Eric ignored the warning signs. He didn't want to believe it. He had fallen for her entirely. One night, while Zoe was in the shower, her phone buzzed repeatedly. Eric never thought of himself as the jealous type, but something in his gut twisted. Against his better judgment, he picked it up. There it was. A string of messages from someone saved as J. Crescent Moon. "Last night was incredible. He still doesn't suspect. Tell him soon. I'm tired of being your secret." The floor seemed to fall out from under Eric. Zoe stepped out of the bathroom wrapped in a towel, humming, her hair damp and wild. Her eyes froze the moment she saw the phone in his hand. "So it's true," Eric said, his voice hollow. She stared at him, searching for a lie that would make it go away, but he saw the truth in her silence. "It started before we got serious," she mumbled. "I didn't know how to end it. And you were safe." That word hit him harder than anything else. Safe. He had been a placeholder. A break from chaos until she decided what she really wanted. Eric didn't yell. He didn't cry. He simply nodded, handed her the phone, and left the apartment they had once called ours. Months later, he would walk past that same bar. A new hostess stood at the door. She greeted him politely, professionally. There was no sparkle, no flirtation, just a nod of recognition. And for the first time in a long time, Eric felt relieved. Some greetings, he now understood, weren't signs of love, they were warnings in disguise. Weeks passed, and the days that followed Zoe's betrayal blurred into a haze for Eric. He threw himself into his work, diving into architectural projects that demanded his full attention. At night, he buried himself in solitude, taking long walks by the river or sipping coffee in the quietest corners of his apartment. The silence was both a refuge and a reminder of what he'd lost. It wasn't just the betrayal that stung. It was the realization that he had been so blind. He'd convinced himself that Zoe cared for him, that their connection was unique. But in the end, he had simply been a safe haven for a girl who couldn't fully commit, who had used him as a bridge between the life she had and the life she wanted. One evening, after another long day at work, Eric decided to go out for a drink. He walked into a different bar, one he hadn't visited in years. It was quiet, with dim lights and soft jazz playing in the background. As he settled into a corner booth, the bartender, an older woman with a knowing smile, brought him a drink without asking. "You look like you've been carrying a heavy load," she remarked, setting the glass in front of him. Eric gave a half smile, the weight of his thoughts still heavy on his chest. "Maybe. It's just hard to shake off." The bartender nodded. "I've seen a lot of men like you in here, trying to outrun the past." The words hit him harder than he expected. Was he trying to outrun the past? Or was he running from the idea of being duped again? As he sipped his drink, lost in thought, A woman slid into the seat opposite him. She was in her 30s, with dark hair and a quiet confidence that reminded Eric of the older women he'd once been drawn to. She didn't smile, but there was something kind in her eyes, a softness, as if she'd seen the same type of pain. "I don't mean to intrude," she said, her voice low, "but I couldn't help but notice the way you're looking at that drink. You're not just thirsty. You're searching for something." Eric didn't know what to say. Maybe she was right. Maybe he had been searching for something all along, something beyond love, beyond the illusions of a perfect relationship. He leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath. "I think I was searching for trust. And I thought I'd found it." She nodded. "Trust is a fragile thing. Once it's broken, it's hard to rebuild. But it's possible." Eric looked at her, intrigued by the calmness in her voice. "Do you believe that?" She smiled softly. "I do. But it takes time. You can't rush it, and you can't force it." For the first time in weeks, Eric felt the walls he had built around himself begin to crack. It wasn't a solution, and it wasn't a quick fix. But hearing those words, those simple, honest words, reminded him that life wasn't about avoiding pain. It was about learning to move through it. "You're right," Eric said quietly. "I don't know what I was expecting from her. But I guess I was just looking for someone who would really see me. Not as a safety net, but as a person." The woman across from him gave a small nod of understanding. "It's a lot to ask of someone. But it starts with seeing yourself first." Eric smiled, this time genuinely. There was a quiet wisdom in her presence. She didn't offer him false promises or quick answers. She simply reminded him that healing was something he needed to do on his own, not for someone else. The rest of the evening passed in comfortable silence, the kind that Eric hadn't experienced in a long time. As he left the bar, he felt lighter, as if a small weight had been lifted off his shoulders. Months later, he would reflect on that night as a turning point. He didn't know where his journey would take him or if he would ever be able to trust someone fully again. But for the first time in a long time, Eric was ready to move forward. Not with Zoe. Not with anyone from his past. But with himself. As the weeks unfolded, Eric began to embrace his own company with a new sense of purpose. The idea of moving on from Zoe felt less like an obligation and more like a process he had to give time to. He continued with his work, poured energy into his hobbies, and took long walks by the river, letting the solitude give him space to think without feeling rushed. One evening, while attending a dinner party hosted by a colleague, Eric met someone who caught his attention. Her name was Sarah, a fellow architect with a sharp wit and a love for classical art. She was older, confident in her own skin, and had a quiet, composed energy that felt both familiar and refreshing. It wasn't the kind of overwhelming attraction he had felt for Zoe, but something deeper, something grounded. Sarah's words were deliberate, thoughtful. She shared stories of her travels, her career, and even her own experiences with betrayal. It wasn't the kind of conversation he was used to, but it was real. Raw. There was no pretense. No performance. Just two people, connecting on a deeper level, speaking not just of what they had done, but of who they had become through their experiences. Weeks turned into months, and Eric found himself spending more time with Sarah, developing a friendship that was free of the pressure to define it. There were no grand gestures, no forced expectations. It was just simple companionship, dinners, walks, spontaneous conversations about everything and nothing. One day, while sitting on a park bench overlooking a quiet lake, Sarah turned to him with a smile. "I've noticed something about you," she said, her voice gentle. Eric raised an eyebrow, curious. "You've stopped looking for validation in other people," she continued. "It's like you've finally figured out that you don't need someone to tell you who you are. You already know." Her words struck him, not because they were revolutionary, but because they were true. He hadn't been looking for validation, not in Zoe, not in anyone. He had spent so many years seeking approval, trying to fit into others' expectations, that he had lost sight of what he really wanted. "I guess I've learned to listen to myself," Eric admitted, his voice steady. "It's taken me a while, but I'm starting to understand that I can't define myself by others anymore." Sarah smiled softly, her gaze thoughtful. "That's a rare thing to find in someone, Eric. A lot of people spend their whole lives searching for that sense of peace." Eric nodded, realizing how far he had come. He was no longer the man who clung to the past, waiting for someone to fix him, to give him a sense of worth. He had finally learned that the only person responsible for his happiness was himself. In time, his connection with Sarah grew, but it was different from what he had once shared with Zoe. It wasn't based on the need to fill a void or to escape loneliness. It was about two people supporting each other, building something slow and steady, with no illusions, no pretenses. Eric had learned that real love wasn't about finding someone to rescue him from his pain. It was about meeting someone who was willing to grow with him, who could embrace his flaws and share in his journey. He had stopped looking for love in all the wrong places, and in doing so, he had found something better than he had ever expected. One evening, while enjoying a quiet dinner at his apartment with Sarah, Eric realized that he no longer feared the idea of being vulnerable. He had let go of the past, Zoe, the betrayal, the confusion, and had embraced the idea that love, if it were to come, would find him when he was ready. Not because he was seeking it out, but because he was open to it in its most authentic form. "I'm glad we met," Eric said quietly, a soft smile tugging at his lips. "Me too," Sarah replied, her eyes warm. "And I'm glad you found your way back to yourself." As they clinked glasses, the quiet understanding between them spoke volumes. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Because now, Eric knew that he didn't need someone to fix him, and he didn't need to search for someone who could complete him. He had already done that for himself. And in that simple, unspoken truth, Eric found peace. As the months continued to unfold, Eric and Sarah's relationship deepened. It was a quiet kind of love, uncomplicated, yet rich with understanding. They spent their days together in shared silence, comfortable in each other's presence, enjoying the small things. They'd wander through art galleries, talk about their dreams, their fears, and their pasts without any rush to define their future. For the first time in years, Eric didn't feel the pressure to rush into something or prove anything to anyone. He had nothing to prove but to himself. One day, while they were out for a walk in a nearby park, Sarah took his hand and led him toward a quiet bench overlooking a field. The trees were just beginning to show the first signs of autumn, their leaves turning shades of gold and red. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of the season. Sarah had been unusually quiet, and Eric could sense that something was on her mind. "Eric," she began, her voice gentle but serious, "there's something I need to tell you." He turned to her, sensing the weight of her words. He squeezed her hand, offering her the space to speak. "I think it's time to be honest with you about something," Sarah said, looking down at their joined hands before meeting his gaze. "I've been where you've been. I've been hurt, betrayed, and tried to move on without really understanding myself. But I realized something. I've been afraid of letting someone in again. Afraid of getting hurt. But with you, I feel different. I don't want to hold back anymore." Eric listened quietly, his heart heavy with understanding. He hadn't expected this confession, but it resonated deeply with him. It was the kind of vulnerability he had longed for, the kind that didn't feel like a need to be fixed but a desire to heal together. "I'm not looking for perfection, Sarah," Eric said softly, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "I just want something real. Something steady. After everything, I've learned that it's not the grand gestures that matter. It's the quiet moments, the understanding between two people, the willingness to be vulnerable, even when it's scary." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, but she smiled. "I've never known someone who could be so honest with himself. So open." "Maybe that's why we both needed time," Eric replied. "To get to a place where we could be honest with each other. I don't need perfection, either. Just honesty. And I think that's what we've got." They sat there for a while, just breathing in the autumn air, letting the words hang between them like a delicate promise. No rush, no expectations. Just two people who had learned the hard way that love wasn't about perfection. It was about growing, together, through the scars and the cracks, and finding something meaningful in the process. Later that evening, they found themselves back at Eric's apartment, curled up on the couch, talking about their lives. It wasn't the kind of passionate, fiery conversation of early relationships. It was something slower, deeper, and more real. There was an ease between them now, a knowing that their pasts, their mistakes, and their scars were simply parts of their stories. They weren't burdens. They were lessons that had led them to this moment. As they sat together, Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder, her breath steady. Eric closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of her presence, and realized that this was what he had been searching for all along. Not a rescue from pain, but a shared journey of healing and growth. And in that quiet, unspoken understanding, Eric felt the final remnants of his past slip away. He was no longer defined by Zoe or the mistakes he had made. He was no longer the man who needed validation from anyone else. He was simply Eric, a man who had learned to trust himself, and who, for the first time in a long time, was learning to trust another. Their relationship wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. It was built on the truth that love wasn't about escaping the past. It was about accepting it, learning from it, and growing stronger because of it. As they sat in the dim light of the living room, Eric knew that the journey wasn't over. Life would continue to surprise him, with its twists and turns, its ups and downs. But he had Sarah by his side now, and for the first time, he wasn't afraid of what the future might bring. He wasn't looking for someone to fix him. He was finally looking for someone to walk beside him. And that, he realized, was the greatest gift of all.